Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our study of the book of Psalms. Today we're in Psalm 106, and last time we came in and read all 48 verses of the psalm. And while it is a lengthy psalm, there's a lot that is being said. It really falls under one particular heading, and that is the lessons that need to be learned and the reminders of God's interaction with what we've called them here old Israel, with the generations that came immediately out of the land of Egypt. Now, all of the accounts that you read about in Psalm 106 are things that are found back in the books of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. There are many different layers to the different accounts that are given, and many different things that are reiterated here that take us back to the mentality of God and the way that God interacted with the people of those days. But what I want us to hone in on is the way that he ties that in to his day. And by extension, we can tie it into our day. Let me show you what I mean. At the beginning of the psalm, in verse 1, he is going to talk about the importance of praising the Lord, of giving glory and thanks to the Lord, for his mercy endures forever. That phrase is not simply a repetitive statement that is expected to be there, but rather it is going to be an emphasis that is going to be the focus of everything else that is discussed. The mercy of God endures forever. He's going to talk about who can utter the mighty acts of the Lord, who can declare all his praise. Blessed are those who keep justice, and he who does righteousness at all times. Remember me, O Lord, with the favor you have toward your people. O visit me with your salvation, that I may see the benefit of your chosen ones, that I may rejoice in the gladness of your nation, that I may glory with your inheritance. So it is a call to God full of praise and of glory, but it is also a plea for remembrance. Why? Well, that's going to be found in verse number 6. Because there in verse 6, the writer says, we have sinned with our fathers. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedly. If you'll notice in many of the things that are going to be stated beginning in verse 7, when he talks about our fathers in Egypt, there's going to be these interactions with God where God does something good for them and they fail to respond in kind. They commit sin and God helps them. They are ones who take God's generosity and they flip it on its head. They are going to complain and God is going to give them help. And at the same time, God is going to, at some point, become fed up with all of the complaining and all of the sin and everything else, and he is going to punish them for their actions. And then they are going to turn back to him, and the cycle is going to continue and it's going to repeat itself. But I want you to notice in verse 6 the statement that is made. He doesn't say they have sinned, he says we have sinned with our fathers. The importance of this statement is not to look back on what they did as to how terrible they were, but to recognize that we are in the exact same boat. You know, it's easy to look back on the lives of others, especially in the rearview mirror of time, and to be able to look at all of the mistakes that they made and how ridiculous it was and how could they do that and how could they act in such a way, how irresponsible could they possibly be, when if we were really to look honestly in the rearview mirror of our own lives, we would see us doing the very same things. Here the psalmist talks about the fact that we have sinned. And he is going to tie what God has done with Israel and the way that God protected and watched over and redeemed and took care of Israel, and yes, punished Israel for their actions when they did wrong, but also loved them and held them and remained with them, to the way that he's going to handle things in his day, and yes, the way that he interacts with us as well. When you move down toward the end of the psalm and you come down to verse 43, I want you to notice what he says. Because after making the statements in verse 40 that the wrath of the Lord was kindled against his people so that he abhorred his own inheritance, he gave them into the hand of the Gentiles, and those who hated them ruled over them. Their enemies also oppressed them, and they were brought into subjection under their hand. But then notice verse 43, where there he says, many times he delivered them. But they rebelled in their counsel and were brought low for their iniquity. Nevertheless, he regarded their affliction when he heard their cry. And for their sake he remembered his covenant. He relented according to the multitude of his mercies. You remember that phrase in verse 1, for his mercy endures forever. Yes, there was punishment involved when they sinned, but that wasn't what God desired for them. God desired something greater, something better. The same holds true for us. He says, we have sinned. And when Israel of old sinned, this was the way God responded. This was the way God handled things, but this was the reason for it, and this was what his desire for it was. As you come to the close of the psalm, in verse 47, he says, save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from among the Gentiles to give thanks to your holy name, to triumph in your praise. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel from everlasting to everlasting. The psalmist here in Psalm 106 is not simply going back and bashing the generations that went before. Instead, what he is doing is he is looking at God's interactions with those that came before, recognizing that his people in his day are in exactly the same boat, and recognizing that the mercies of God endure forever, and that God is willing to have the same care and the same love and the same response for those of his day that he had for the Israel in the days of old. And so it is also the case with us, because we have sinned. And yet, God is still willing, even though there will be consequences for our actions, even though we are going to be held responsible for what it is we do, we still have a God who today, just like in days gone by, wants us to be with him, wants to have the relationship with us that is the best relationship that he can have, and is willing to regard our affliction, is willing to hear our cries, and will be there for us when we turn to him. That is the lesson of Psalm 106. I hope that you have benefited from the things that we've talked about today. Thank you so much for watching the video. And next time we'll come back and we will look at Psalm 107. I hope that you will join us then. But until then, I hope you have a great day.